one of the places that started me off getting interested in history and architecture. It's Bute Castle, which is in Cumbria, about 20 miles northeast of Carlisle, a few miles north of the Roman Wall. I used to cycle up here when I was a callow youth and my legs still worked, with a pannier full of sandwiches and lashings of lemonade. And what I was after was history, because there's lashings of that here too. These bumps, if we were being a bit posher, we'd call them earthworks, cover the outer walls of a Roman fort, a sort of advanced fort north of Hadrian's Wall, to house scouts and give warnings of attacks on the wall itself. It got attacked itself at least once, and probably loads of times. But there's evidence of a catastrophic attack at the end of the 3rd century, with masses of destruction. So here I am inside the walls of the Roman fort, where there's not only a nice old farm, but also a medieval castle built entirely of stolen Roman stones. It's a very tough and rough castle, a totally no-frills castle, because here we're only a few miles from the border with Scotland. And this area, which is called Bute Castle Waste, was one of the wildest and most dangerous parts of the border, and the castle here was one of the most remote royal outposts, a really dangerous posting.
Oh no, sir, please don't send me to Bute Castle, sir.
So here we are in wild border country, the edge of nowhere, surrounded by the savagery of Roman times and the savagery of the Middle Ages, and in the middle of it all is something else, something quite remarkable, an Anglo-Saxon cross built in the middle of the Dark Ages. Except it's not a cross anymore, it's just the shaft of a cross. The head has been lost for centuries.
Perhaps it's buried or stuck in the middle of some later wall, which is an intriguing thought. Makes you want to keep your eyes peeled, just in case. But what's left is special enough. The Bute Castle cross is England's most impressive Anglo-Saxon cross. 14 and a bit feet of sandstone, 14 and a bit 100 years old. This cross has stood out here in the no-nonsense northern weather for 1400 years.
It's proof that what we amusingly used to call the Dark Ages weren't so dark after all, because this is a fantastically civilised piece of carving.
The runes here reveal that it was carved as a memorial to a man who died in 670 AD. Now, in 670 AD, you'll have to take it from me, but there was nowhere else in Europe except what we now call the North, where people could carve stone, and especially carve human figures, as realistically as this. That's St. John on the bottom, and John the Baptist up at the top, and Jesus in the middle. They really look like people. Nobody else could do that. The figures are almost Roman in their perfection. Or this scroll. I mean, it's a vine scroll, a single continuous scroll, 14 feet long, inhabited by birds and beasts, which have been carefully and symmetrically placed among the leaves.
It's beautifully done, but you know, there were no vines in the north in 670, so whoever carved this marvellous vine scroll had to have had contact with far-off places, with the Mediterranean or the Middle East.
Other bits of the decoration are what we usually call Celtic. This interlaced knotwork is Celtic, so this cross in a wild bit of the north brings together the Celtic world and the Mediterranean to produce something new and very English.
I've spent a long time on this because I like it and it's my programme, but mainly because it's a clear reminder that the north 1400 years ago wasn't a dark place at all, but one of the most civilised places in Europe. We have a tendency to think of the past as scabby because they didn't have fridges and MP3 players and whatnot. And we have a particular tendency to think that about the north because southerners so often tell us that it's grim up here.
Of course, it's not grim now, but 1400 years ago it certainly wasn't. The Venerable Bede, who was a monk who lived in Jarrow and Sunderland at that time, described the place that he lived in like this. It is rich in crops and trees, and has good grazing for cattle. Land and seabirds flourish here, and it's famous for its rivers with their abundance of fish. The nights are light in summer, so that often people watching at midnight are uncertain whether the evening twilight still lingers or morning dawn has already arrived.
Doesn't it sound nice? I bet you wished you lived somewhere as nice as that. Well, of course you do. Most of us do. Because Bede never left the north, and he was describing the sort of places that he lived in. Places like this.
This is Hisham, which is in North Lancashire, and is more or less surrounded by modern Morecambe nowadays. But its name tells you that it's an Anglo-Saxon settlement. That Ham is a sure giveaway. It meant village in Anglo-Saxon. We still use the sound in the word hamlet, which means a little village, villagelet. It is, and it must always have been, in a glorious position, with lovely views over to the Lake District hills. You can't believe that the first settlers didn't choose it, at least partly for the view. They often chose places like this, headlands with dramatic views, to build their churches, and that's what they did here. St Peter's, the parish church, is Saxon, though it's been extended and altered loads of times over the centuries, but it has a couple of surviving Saxon doorways and a Saxon window. Actually, Hisham has two Anglo-Saxon churches because right next door to St Peter's there's a ruined chapel. This chapel is traditionally associated with the Celtic missionary St Patrick, who lived back in the 4th century. It's called St Patrick's Chapel. But in fact what's here is Anglo-Saxon. This is a very typical Anglo-Saxon doorway with its round-arched head. You don't often see them grooved like that, so this is a bit posher than most. But Hisham has got something much more unusually Saxon. These are called the rock-hewn tombs, because, you might be interested to know, they are tombs which have been hewn out of the rock. Now these are Saxon too, and this place must have been very important to people if they were prepared to go to the bother of hewing their graves out of solid rock.
As you can see, they're rather small by comparison to me. Though that's a meaningless thing to say unless you know what size I am. But I am 5'8" and a bit, and I weigh several stones, but I couldn't possibly get into one of them. And that's because they were really ossuaries for holding the bones.
To the Anglo-Saxons, flesh was temporary and passed away. Bones were symbols of immortality. So Hisham's got Saxon doorways and Saxon tombs, but neither of those are the real reason why I came here. I've really come to show you this little bit of a Saxon cross.
This is the base of the sort of Saxon cross that we've already seen at Bewcastle. Heaven knows where the rest of it is. It's got the same sort of scrolly carving that we saw at Bewcastle, but it's also got something very, very unusual, and that's the carving of a building with 3 windows in it and little faces peeping out. And at the bottom there's a recess with a swathed figure in it, who might be Jesus in his tomb, or possibly Lazarus waiting to be risen from the dead.
But to me it's the building which is interesting, because this is exactly the sort of church building that the Anglo-Saxons built in northern England. It's very tall and very narrow. Saxon churches further south don't have these proportions, but northern ones do. They're the oldest buildings I know which seem to have a distinctively northern style, and quite a number of them still exist.
At least 24 northern churches still have complete Saxon west towers, and this is one of them. This is the west tower at Hovingham Church in North Yorkshire near York. It's a bit posher than most because it's got rather a splendid west doorway.
And here's the inside of the tower, which includes a rather mysterious high-level doorway. What was it for? But apart from the tower, Hovingham has got 2 ancient carvings. This one is Anglo-Saxon. It was carved about the year 800 AD. It's a bit worn, I'm afraid, as you would be if you'd been carved in the year 800. But I think you can still tell what a beautiful thing it must have been when it was new. It's got one of those lovely scrolls along the bottom, and a row of little arches along the top, and excellent little figures.
That's a really civilised bit of art. I'm not sure what it was. Part of a tomb, perhaps, or the front of an altar. But remember that, a really sophisticated bit of carving. Now compare it with this. Is this carving as civilised? Me thinketh not. This is rougher, less disciplined, and the reason is that this was carved by a different people altogether, wilder and less civilised, people who were going to come as a bit of a rude shock to the Anglo-Saxons. This cross was carved by the Vikings.
This is the island of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumberland. There was a monastery founded here in the year 635, and for the next 150 years it grew to be an incredibly important centre of learning, art, religion, civilization. Everything that was important in those Anglo-Saxon days. Virtually nothing of it survives above ground anymore. The glorious ruins that are here now were built in the Middle Ages, but back in Saxon days it was a huge monastery and extraordinarily rich.
Which is presumably why in June 793 it was attacked by the Vikings. Everybody writing at the time agreed that it was a pretty devastating experience. Apparently, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, terrible portents appeared across the land of the Northumbrians, miserably frightening the people. Immense sheets of light flashing across the sky, whirlwind and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. That can be very unsettling. I think fiery dragons are particularly unsettling, but it was all a portent, of course, because on the 6th of June, heathen men miserably destroyed God's church through rapine and slaughter.
Sounds bad, doesn't it? And there are other clues which show how terrible these events must have seemed at the time. This gravestone was carved a little later than 793, but it seems to show a violent attack by men with swords and axes. They look as if they might be wearing chain mail. And on the other side there's a sun and a moon and a cross, people praying.
That's supposed to represent the end of the world, but if you put the two sides together, it seems to suggest not just a general sense of end of worldliness, but the end of this particular world of Lindisfarne, slaughtered by the Vikings.
They have a terrible reputation, the Vikings. History shows them as nasty, rough men-beasts in their horned helmets, getting up to all sorts of unspeakable things.
But I have a but, and it's a big but. You see, if you've been to school recently and done your Key Stage 3 project, you'll realise that the Vikings never actually wore horned helmets, and it's not really clear how savagely they attacked this place either. You see, the problem is they clearly didn't destroy it all that efficiently. Nobody's yet found any physical evidence of burning or destruction.
And the island has a whole collection of beautifully carved Christian gravestones which date from the centuries after the Viking attacks. Even the parish church shows a lot of evidence that it continued in use long after the Viking raids.
There aren't a lot of signs from outside, but there are things if you know what to look for. These cornerstones, for example, or coins, if you wanted to be more technical, are clearly Saxon. Everything round about is added later, but the core of the building is Anglo-Saxon, and that's even more clear inside. A few years ago, as part of a restoration, the plaster was stripped off the wall above the 13th century chancel arch. That's this one here. And what should emerge, boys and girls, but a completely unexpected Saxon wall, complete with Saxon arch and Saxon stonework, and even one of those high-level doorways like we saw at Hovingham.
So this church, despite being pillaged by the Vikings, clearly survived the centuries. And I'll tell you another thing. This monastery had at least two unbelievably valuable objects. It had this, This is a copy, of course, but it had the extraordinary Lindisfarne Gospels, which were not only a glorious work of art, but were also bound in a cover thick with gold and jewels, just the sort of loot that you'd expect the Vikings to seek out. But they never got it, and they never got the body of St Cuthbert either, the monastery's resident saint and the main source of its wealth. First time the Vikings seemed to just miss them, and even the second time the monks got away without losing a thing. They just set off with the body of the saint in his coffin and all of their principal treasures. They even took one of their 2 churches with them. It was a wooden one. They took that and they escaped. How did they do it? Were the Vikings just rubbish pillagers? Or were the attacks less terrifying than contemporary writers said? I don't know, but whatever the truth, as we all know, I'm sure the Vikings eventually gave up raiding and came to settle here for good. So what did they leave behind them? Well, the answer is surprisingly little, at least on the surface. This is little Langdale, right in the heart of the Lake District, an area that seems to have been entirely taken over by the Vikings. But what have they left behind?
Well, names first of all, personal names. If you've got a son after your name, Williamson or Robinson or Thompson, well, you're showing your Viking origins. But places too. Every feature, every fragment of every feature, every dale or beck, crag or scree or how, they're all Viking.
But after that, what else? No buildings. They built in wood, the Vikings, so their houses are all gone, and anyway they almost certainly chose the best places to build, so that the places where they lived have all been redeveloped dozens of times since. Here's an example: Fellfoot Farm, a classic Lake District farmhouse with a classic Viking name. I bet Vikings lived on this very spot, but is there any sign of its Viking origins?
Well, extraordinarily there is, and this is it. A little piece of, what am I saying, a huge piece of Viking history. This is a Thing Moot. I bet you haven't got a Thing Moot, not many of us have, because this is the only one known on the British mainland, and what it was a sort of Viking town hall.
Thing was Viking for assembly, so this assembly mound was their council chamber. It was where the settlers assembled to elect speakers and proclaim new laws.
It's a process that still goes on today on the Isle of Man. On the 5th of July, I believe, the Isle of Man government still meets on their Thing Moot, the hill of Tynwald. But I like to think of it happening here, surrounded by the hills, with the crags reverberating with the sound of Viking horns.
And here I am back at Hisham in North Lancashire. Told you a lie before, at least only half the truth, when I said we'd come just for the Anglo-Saxon stuff, because there's something even more interesting inside. It's a Viking something, and it's known as a hogback. Sometimes it's known as a hogback tomb, but I'm not sure that anybody's absolutely certain it was ever a tombstone nowadays. But what it is very, very rare. There's one of these in Ireland, there's a couple in Glasgow, but all of the rest are in northern England. There aren't even any in Scandinavia. So this is unique to the north, and it's very, very odd. It's called a hogback because the top is curved, apparently, like the back of a hog. I'm not very hot on hogs. But it's also carved with tiles or shingles so that it seems to represent a roof. And there are beasts at the end. These are bears that seem to be clutching the end of the roof. And people say that this represents as close to the appearance of a Viking house as we're ever likely to get. But this one has also got carvings on the side. And there are hunting scenes and other wild things which seem to be from the ancient saga of Sigmund and his son Sigurd. That's Sigurd down there looking suitably wild. Was he something of a saga lout? This stone, like all the hogbacks, seems to have been carved when the Vikings first arrived in England, round about the year 950. There were no bears in England at that time, but there were in Scandinavia, and bears represented the wildness and the courage of warriors. To see what they became, we need to go across the country to the village of Kirkdale on the south side of the Yorkshire moors.
Kirkdale. Kirk is Viking for church and Dale for valley, and here is the church in the valley, St Gregory's Church, the middle bit of which was built almost 1,000 years ago. In fact, I can be more precise than that. It was built about 947 years ago.
I can be that precise because of this sundial, whose inscription reveals that the church was built by Orm, son of Gamel, and that the builders were two priests called Howarth and Brand, and that they built it when Edward the Confessor was King of England and Tostig the Earl of Northumberland, and that narrows it down to about the year 1060. This is a remarkable object, and it's built into a church which is pure Anglo-Saxon.
The tower arch is about 1,000,000 miles high and about 2 inches wide, typical Saxon proportions. The chancel arch isn't that different, and there are several splendid bits of Anglo-Saxon carving about. You would look at this and you would say that this was an Anglo-Saxon church. But all of the names on that sundial are Viking names. The language of the inscription is Old English, but written in a sort of Viking dialect.
So here we are in a Viking village owned by Viking people, and the first thing they do is build a church, which means that they become Christian, which they almost certainly weren't when they first attacked Lindisfarne. But the more remarkable thing is the church that they built is an Anglo-Saxon church, and the inscription is written in Anglo-Saxon language. This isn't what's supposed to happen in an invasion. When the British invaded North America, they didn't become Native Americans. They stuffed the local culture and replaced it with their own. But the Vikings didn't. They must be the only conquering invaders in history who ended up as identical to the people that they'd conquered.